The lightning split the darkened sky like God's own rage, illuminating the desolate main street of Snowflake, Arizona Territory, as Lillian Matthews ran toward the only building still showing light at this ungodly hour. Her soaked dress clung to her trembling form as another crack of thunder shook the heavens, drowning out her desperate pounding on the door of what appeared to be a trading post. The year was 1884, and Lillian had never felt more alone. The stage coach that had deposited her in this remote outpost hours earlier had continued on its way to Hallbrook, leaving her with instructions to wait for her uncle's wagon. But Uncle Frank never arrived, and the modest hotel where she'd secured lodging had suffered a kitchen fire shortly after dinner, forcing all guests to evacuate. In the confusion, she'd left her room key and belongings inside, and the harried proprietor had locked the establishment until morning, promising to sort everything out once the storm passed. "Hello," Lillian called, her voice barely audible over the howling wind and pounding rain. "Is anyone there?" "Please, I need shelter." Another flash of lightning revealed a movement behind the dusty window. The door creaked open, and a tall figure stood silhouetted against the warm lamplight inside. "Madam," the man's deep voice carried concern, "what in tarnation are you doing out in this hellish weather?" "I'm locked out of the hotel," Lillian explained, teeth chattering. "There was a fire, and get yourself in here before you catch your death," he interrupted, pulling the door wider and stepping aside. Lillian stumbled across the threshold, rainwater pooling around her feet on the rough wooden planks. The man closed the door against the tempest, and she got her first good look at her rescuer. He stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build evident even beneath his simple cotton shirt. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's growth of beard. Dark hair fell in damp waves to his collar, and his eyes, a striking hazel that caught the lamplight, assessed her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Thank you," Lillian managed, hugging herself against the chill. "I didn't know where else to go." "Name's Hank Edwards," he said, reaching for a wool blanket draped over a nearby chair. "I own this trading post." "Lillian Matthews," she replied, gratefully accepting the blanket. "I arrived on the afternoon stage. My uncle was supposed to meet me, but—" She trailed off, realizing how foolish she must appear to this stranger. "Frank Matthews is your uncle?" Hank asked, surprise evident in his voice. Lillian nodded, clutching the blanket tighter. "Do you know him?" "Everyone around these parts knows Frank," Hank said, moving to stoke the small stove in the corner of the room. "His ranch is about 15 miles north of here. If he didn't show, there's likely a good reason. The creek between here and his place floods something terrible when it storms like this." The trading post was modestly furnished but well stocked. Shelves lined the walls, filled with canned goods, tools, ammunition, and sundry items needed for survival in the territory. A small counter with a ledger book separated the retail space from what appeared to be Hank's living quarters in the back. "I live above the store," Hank explained, noticing her gaze. "Not much, but it's dry and warm. You're welcome to stay until morning." Lillian felt a flutter of apprehension. Her mother had raised her to be proper, and staying unchaperoned with a man she'd just met would be scandalous back in Boston. But this was the Arizona Territory, and propriety seemed less important than survival. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Edwards, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition, Miss Matthews, and please call me Hank." He moved behind the counter and pulled out a ceramic mug. "I've got coffee that's still hot. It'll warm you up while your clothes dry." As Lillian sipped the strong, black coffee, Hank busied himself arranging a makeshift bed on a bench near the stove. The intimacy of the situation wasn't lost on her, a young woman of 22, alone with a man who appeared to be in his early 30s, during a violent storm in a town where she knew no one. "How long have you been in Snowflake?" she asked, trying to establish some normalcy in the unusual circumstances. "Going on 5 years now," Hank replied, draping another blanket over the bench. "Came west after the war looking for a fresh start. Worked as a ranch hand for a spell, then saved enough to buy this place when old man Finley wanted to move on to California." He paused, studying her. "And you, What brings a Boston lady to our little corner of the territory? Lillian's eyebrows rose in surprise. How did you know I'm from Boston? A small smile played at the corners of Hank's mouth. Your accent, for one, and those shoes much too fine for Arizona dirt. Lillian glanced down at her mud-splattered but clearly expensive boots. I suppose they are, she admitted. I came because Uncle Frank is my only remaining family. My parents died in a fire last winter in the family home. She swallowed hard. Well, there were debts I didn't know about. Once everything was settled, there wasn't much left. Hank's expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Matthews. Please call me Lillian, she said, offering a small smile in return. It seemed silly to stand on formality given the circumstances. Outside, the storm continued its assault. Rain lashed against the windows and wind howled through the eaves of the building. Occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the room, followed by thunderclaps that seemed to shake the very foundation. This storm ain't letting up anytime soon, Hank observed, moving to check that the shutters were secure. Might as well make yourself comfortable. I've got some jerky and biscuits if you're hungry. As they shared the simple meal, Lillian found herself studying her host. Despite his rough exterior, there was a gentleness to Hank Edwards that put her at ease. His movements were measured and deliberate, his speech thoughtful. Most surprising was his obvious education. He spoke well, with a vocabulary that belied his frontier surroundings. You're wondering how a man like me ended up running a trading post in Snowflake, Hank said suddenly, catching her gaze. Lillian blushed. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stare. No offense taken, he assured her. I was a teacher before the war, taught mathematics in a small school outside Richmond. Afterward, well, some scars don't show on the outside. The candid admission touched something in Lillian. The war changed many lives, she said softly. My father lost his brother at Gettysburg. Hank nodded solemnly. Too many good men never came home. He cleared his throat. What about you? Were you a teacher back in Boston? A governess, Lillian corrected. For the Whittington family, their youngest daughter was my charge for 3 years. I had hoped to open my own small school someday. She traced the rim of her cup with her finger. Perhaps I still will once I'm settled at Uncle Frank's ranch. Snowflake could use a proper school, Hank remarked. The children get basic instruction from the minister's wife, but nothing beyond reading, writing, and simple arithmetic. Is there a large community of children here? Lillian asked, interest piqued. Between the town families and the outlying ranches, I'd say 24 or more of school age, Hank replied. Good kids, most of them, just need someone to guide them proper. A particularly loud crack of thunder made Lillian jump, nearly spilling her coffee. Sorry, she apologized. I've never been fond of storms. No need to apologize, Hank said, his voice gentle. Lightning's nothing to take lightly out here. It started more than one range fire over the years. Lillian suppressed a shiver. How much longer do you think it will last? Hard to say. These summer storms can blow through quickly or linger for days. Seeing her dismay, he added, but this one feels like the passing kind, probably clear by morning. The conversation flowed naturally between them as the hours passed. Lillian learned that Hank had come west after serving with the Union Army, working his way across the country, before settling in the Arizona Territory. He spoke of the land with reverence, and of the people, settlers and natives alike, with respect. In turn, she told him about her life in Boston, her love of literature, and her hopes for the future. It's getting late, Hank said eventually, noticing Lillian trying to stifle a yawn. You should try to get some rest. He gestured to the bench he'd prepared. It's not much, but it's better than nothing. Thank you, Lillian said sincerely, for everything. I'll be in the back room if you need anything, Hank assured her, moving to turn down the lamp. Sleep well, Lillian. Long after Hank had retired, Lillian lay awake, listening to the storm's fury gradually diminish. The trading post creaked and settled around her, unfamiliar sounds in an unfamiliar place. Yet somehow she felt safe. There was something about Hank Edwards that inspired trust, a steadiness, a quiet strength that reassured her. She wondered what tomorrow would bring. Would Uncle Frank arrive to collect her once the roads were passable? Would she ever see Hank Edwards again after she left for her uncle's ranch? The thought brought an unexpected pang of regret. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and Lillian drifted into sleep with the gentle patter of rain as her lullaby. Morning came with startling brightness. Lillian woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee and something delicious cooking. For a moment, disorientation gripped her, but then the events of the previous night came rushing back. She sat up, smoothing her wrinkled dress as best she could and attempting to tame her tousled hair with her fingers. Her efforts were interrupted by Hank emerging from the back room, carrying a plate of what appeared to be flapjacks. "Morning," he greeted, setting the plate on a small table. "Thought you might be hungry." "That's very kind, thank you," Lillian replied, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "There's a wash basin behind the curtain if you'd like to freshen up," Hank offered, seemingly reading her thoughts, "and I've put out some coffee." Grateful for his thoughtfulness, Lillian excused herself to the small washing area. The cool water revived her, and she did her best to make herself presentable. When she emerged, Hank was standing at the front window, gazing out at the sun-drenched street. "Storms past," he observed. "But it's left its mark. Street's a river of mud, and I can see down tree limbs over at the church." Lillian joined him at the breakfast table, where steam rose invitingly from the stack of flapjacks. "What about the road to my uncle's ranch?" Hank's expression grew contemplative. "Hard to say without seeing it, but if the creek flooded as I suspect, it might not be passable for another day or two." "Oh," Lillian tried to hide her disappointment. "I should check at the hotel, see if I can retrieve my belongings and perhaps secure a room again." "No rush," Hank said, pouring coffee for them both. "Eat first. Town's still waking up." As they shared breakfast, Lillian found herself studying Hank in the morning light. Clean-shaven now, his features were even more striking: high cheekbones, a straight nose, and those expressive hazel eyes that seemed to shift color with his mood. He'd changed into a fresh shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms marked with the occasional scar testament to a life of physical labor. "You're staring again," Hank noted, though his tone held amusement rather than reproach. Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I apologize. I was just thinking about how strange life can be," she admitted. "Yesterday at this time, I was on a stagecoach, uncertain what awaited me in Snowflake. I certainly never imagined I'd be having breakfast with the proprietor of the trading post after being locked out in a storm all night." Hank's smile reached his eyes, creating small crinkles at the corners. "Life out here is full of unexpected turns. You learn to adapt or you don't survive." "Is that why you stayed?" Lillian asked. "Because you adapted well?" Hank considered her question, taking a thoughtful sip of his coffee. "Partly. The other part is that for the first time since the war, I found peace here. There's something about this land, harsh as it can be, that speaks to a man's soul." His words resonated with Lillian more than she expected. She'd come west, seeking not just family, but also a new beginning. Perhaps Snowflake could offer her the same peace it had given Hank. Their conversation was interrupted by the jingling of the bell above the door as it swung open. A weathered man in his 50s stood there, hat in hand, his clothes bearing evidence of hard travel. Uncle Frank. Lillian exclaimed, rising from her seat. Frank Matthews looked relieved as his gaze fell upon his niece. "Lillian, thank the Lord you're safe. When I heard about the hotel fire, I feared the worst." He crossed the room in 3 long strides to embrace her. "I'm fine, Uncle," Lillian assured him, returning his hug. "Mr. Edwards was kind enough to offer me shelter during the storm." Frank turned to Hank, extending his hand. "I'm in your debt, Edwards. This girl is all the family I have left." Hank shook the offered hand firmly. "No debt, Frank." "Anyone would have done the same." "Not just anyone," Frank disagreed. "Half the folk in this territory would have left her to fend for herself or worse." He turned back to Lillian. "I would have been here yesterday, but the creek was running higher than I've ever seen it. Bridges washed out. Had to ride the long way around, and even then, it was dicey in spots." "How long before the bridge is repaired?" Lillian asked. Frank scratched his graying beard. "Hard to say. A week, maybe more, but there's no need to wait. We can take the mountain trail home. It's longer but passable on horseback." Lillian felt a curious reluctance at the thought of leaving so soon. "My things are still at the hotel," she said, "and I should settle my account before departing." Of course, Frank agreed. We can attend to that now, then be on our way by midday. Hank, who had been quietly observing the reunion, spoke up. Why not join me for the midday meal before you set out? It's the least I can offer after Frank's long ride. Frank's face brightened. That's mighty kind, Edwards. And it'll give me a chance to hear how my niece survived her first night in the territory. The three made their way to the hotel, where Lillian was relieved to find her trunk undamaged by the fire, which had been contained to the kitchen area. The proprietor was profusely apologetic about the previous night's confusion and refused to accept payment for the interrupted stay. Word travels fast in a small town, Frank explained as they left the hotel. By now, everyone knows you spent the night at Hank's store during the storm. Lillian felt her cheeks warm. Will that cause difficulties? Frank chuckled. Might have in Boston, but out here, folks understand survival comes before propriety. Besides, Hank Edwards is the most respected man in Snowflake. No one would dare suggest anything improper. This information surprised Lillian. He seems so solitary. Keeps to himself, sure, Frank agreed. But when there's trouble, he's the first man people turn to. Fair in his dealings, generous when someone's in need, and handy with both words and weapons when the situation calls for it. By the time they returned to the trading post, Hank had prepared a simple but hearty meal of beans, corn bread, and preserved venison. As they ate, Frank regaled Lillian with stories of the ranch and the surrounding country, painting a picture of the life that awaited her. It's rough living compared to Boston, he cautioned, but there's beauty in it too. The sunrise over the mountains, the wildflowers after a spring rain, the stars at night clearer than you've ever seen them. You make it sound magical, Uncle, Lillian said, smiling. It can be, Frank agreed. Though magical doesn't put food on the table or cattle in the corral. Your niece mentioned she was a governess in Boston, Hank interjected. We were discussing the need for a proper school here in Snowflake. Frank's eyebrows rose. Is that so? Well, there's certainly call for it. The Olsons alone have 5 young ones who could use proper schooling. Lillian felt a spark of excitement at the prospect. I had hoped to establish a small school eventually, perhaps once I'm settled at the ranch. Something to consider, Frank said thoughtfully. Though it's a fair distance to ride each day. You'd be welcome to use the back room of the trading post, Hank offered unexpectedly. It's going to waste as it is, and it's central to town. Lillian's heart quickened at the suggestion and the implication that she might have reason to return to Snowflake regularly. That's a generous offer, Mr. Edwards. Hank, he corrected gently, and it's practical more than generous. Educated children grow into adults who can read contracts and calculate accounts good for business all around. Frank chuckled. Always the shrewd businessman, Edwards. He pushed back from the table and rose. Well, we should be on our way if we want to reach the ranch before dark. As Lillian gathered her few belongings, she felt an unexpected sadness at the prospect of leaving. In just one night, Hank Edwards had become, what? Not quite a friend, but more than a mere acquaintance. A connection, perhaps, to this new world she was entering. Outside, Frank had secured Lillian's trunk to a sturdy packhorse and prepared a gentle mare for her to ride. She's even tempered, he assured her, helping Lillian mount. Just hold the reins steady and she'll follow my lead. Hank stood in the doorway of his trading post, watching the preparations. As Frank checked the saddle cinches one last time, Lillian guided her horse closer to where Hank stood. I don't know how to thank you properly, she said, looking down at him from her perch. No thanks needed, Hank replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. But I meant what I said about the school. Think on it. I will, Lillian promised. Perhaps I'll return to discuss it further once I'm settled. Something flickered in Hank's eyes, a warmth that made Lillian's breath catch. I'd like that, he said simply. Frank mounted his own horse with the ease of a man who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. Ready, Lillian? With a final glance at Hank, Lillian nodded. Ready, Uncle. As they rode out of town, Lillian couldn't resist looking back one last time. Hank still stood in the doorway of his trading post, a solitary figure against the weathered wood. He raised a hand in farewell, and Lillian returned the gesture before turning her attention to the trail ahead. The journey to Frank's ranch took the remainder of the day. They followed a winding path through pine-covered hills, across meadows brilliant with wildflowers, and along rocky ridges that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding countryside. Frank pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his 30 years in the territory, painting a vivid picture of the community Lillian was joining. By the time they crested the final ridge, the sun was low in the western sky, bathing the landscape in golden light. Below them lay a broad valley, bisected by a silver ribbon of creek. Near its banks stood a cluster of buildings, the main house constructed of sturdy logs, a large barn, and several smaller outbuildings. "Welcome to Silver Creek Ranch," Frank said proudly. "It's not much compared to your Boston home, but it's beautiful," Lillian interrupted. Genuinely moved by the peaceful scene before her, Frank's weathered face softened with pleasure. "Your Aunt Sarah loved it too. Always said there wasn't a prettier spot in all the territory." His voice held a note of old grief. "She's been gone 5 years now, God rest her soul." As they descended into the valley, Lillian saw a figure emerge from the barn, a woman of middle years, wiping her hands on her apron as she walked toward the house. "That's Martha Wilkins," Frank explained. "Widow woman from over Holbrook Way. Comes by twice a week to help with cooking and washing. Asked her to stay over today, get the house proper for your arrival." Martha proved to be a cheerful, no-nonsense woman who had prepared a welcoming supper and readied the small bedroom that would be Lillian's new home. After the long ride, Lillian was grateful for the hot meal and the simple comfort of clean sheets and a soft mattress. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive as her mind replayed the events of the past 2 days, particularly her unexpected encounter with a certain hazel-eyed trading post owner. The following weeks were a period of adjustment as Lillian adapted to life on the ranch. The work was harder than anything she'd experienced in Boston, but there was satisfaction in it. She learned to tend the vegetable garden, to make soap from rendered fat and lye, to preserve the summer's bounty for the lean winter months ahead. Frank proved to be patient and kind, never criticizing her mistakes as she acquired these new skills. When Martha visited, she brought news from town, and Lillian found herself listening intently for any mention of Hank Edwards. She told herself it was merely curiosity about the man who had sheltered her during the storm, but the flutter in her stomach when his name was mentioned suggested otherwise. "That Edwards fellow asked after you last market day," Martha mentioned casually one afternoon as they shelled peas on the porch. "Wanted to know if you'd settled in well." Lillian tried to appear nonchalant. That was thoughtful of him. Martha's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "Thoughtful, yes, and unusual. Hank Edwards keeps his own counsel most days, not one for idle chit-chat." Lillian changed the subject, but Martha's words lingered in her mind. Was it significant that Hank had inquired about her, or merely politeness to a newcomer he'd assisted? The opportunity to find out came sooner than expected. 3 weeks after her arrival, Frank announced they would be traveling to town for supplies. "Bridge is repaired," he explained, "so we can take the wagon. Thought you might like to see a bit more of Snowflake than just the hotel and trading post." Lillian tried to ignore the surge of excitement at the prospect. "That would be lovely, Uncle. I should like to inquire about the possibility of starting a school as well." Frank's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Among other inquiries, I imagine." The journey to town was far easier by wagon on the main road than their circuitous horseback route had been. As they approached Snowflake, Lillian found herself straightening her simple calico dress and adjusting the bonnet that shaded her face from the summer sun. Their first stop was the general store, where Frank introduced Lillian to Mrs. Pemberton, the proprietor's wife, who clucked over how thin Lillian seemed and insisted on adding a package of peppermint sticks to their order to put some flesh on those bones. Next came the post office, where a letter awaited Frank news that his sister-in-law in St. Louis had passed peacefully in her sleep. Though the woman had been a distant relation, the reminder of mortality sobered their mood as they continued their errands. They saved the trading post for last. Lillian's heart raced as Frank guided the wagon to a stop before the familiar building. The windows gleamed in the afternoon sun, and fresh paint brightened the sign above the door. "Place looks better than I remember," Frank commented. Edwards must be prospering. The bell jingled as they entered, and Lillian's gaze immediately sought the tall figure she remembered. Instead, a young boy of perhaps 12 stood behind the counter, carefully weighing sugar into a paper cone for an elderly customer. Afternoon, Timothy, Frank greeted the boy. Your uncle about, the boy looked up, his face Lillian noticed with a start bearing a distinct resemblance to Hank's. Yes, sir, Mr. Matthews. He's in the storeroom taking inventory. Shall I fetch him? If you would, son. As Timothy disappeared through a door behind the counter, the elderly customer finished her transaction and turned to leave, nodding politely to Frank and Lillian as she passed. Edward's nephew, Frank explained in a low voice. Orphaned in a smallpox outbreak over in New Mexico 3 years back. Hank's raised him since. Before Lillian could process this new information, the storeroom door opened again and Hank emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. He stopped short at the sight of them, and Lillian wasn't sure, but she thought his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary. Frank, he greeted, extending his hand. Good to see you. His gaze shifted to Lillian, and the warmth in it made her cheeks heat. Miss Matthews, you're looking well. Ranch life agrees with you, it seems. Thank you, Mr. Edwards, she replied, pleased that her voice remained steady despite the sudden flutter in her chest. I'm adjusting, though I still have much to learn. Hank, he reminded her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. We don't stand on ceremony in Snowflake. As Frank discussed his order with Hank, Lillian found herself drawn to a shelf of books, a surprising find in a frontier trading post. Her fingers traced the leather spines reverently. Shakespeare, Dickens, Austen, alongside practical volumes on animal husbandry, agriculture, and medicine. See anything that interests you? Hank's voice, closer than expected, startled her. I didn't expect to find such a collection here, she admitted, particularly not the novels. Books are the one luxury I allow myself, Hank said, had them shipped from back east at considerable expense. You're welcome to borrow any that catch your fancy. That's very kind, Lillian replied, genuinely touched by the offer. I left most of my own books behind in Boston. Reading material is the one thing I've truly missed. Then consider my library at your disposal, Hank said. He hesitated, then added, I've been meaning to ask if you've given any more thought to the school idea. Lillian nodded. I have, actually. Uncle Frank thinks it's a fine notion, provided I can arrange transportation to and from town regularly. I mentioned it to Reverend Simmons, Hank continued. He's enthusiastic about the prospect, says the town council would likely approve funds for basic supplies and a modest salary if a qualified teacher could be found. Truly, Lillian couldn't hide her excitement. I would need to present my credentials, of course, and perhaps develop a proposed curriculum. The council meets the first Monday of each month, Hank informed her. Next meeting's in 2 weeks. If you're serious about this, I could speak to the chairman, arrange for you to present your case. Frank, who had been settling his account with Timothy, rejoined them in time to hear the last part of the conversation. That's mighty helpful of you, Edwards. Lillian's been sketching out lesson plans these past weeks, haven't you, girl? Lillian nodded, somewhat embarrassed by her uncle's disclosure of her private activities. Just preliminary ideas, she clarified. Well, bring those ideas to the council meeting, Hank encouraged, snowflakes growing. We've had 3 new families settle here this year alone, all with young children. A proper school would be a powerful draw for more decent folk looking to put down roots. As they prepared to leave, Hank selected a volume of Tennyson's poetry from the shelf and handed it to Lillian. To start your borrowing, he explained. I thought you might enjoy it during the quiet evenings at the ranch. The thoughtfulness of the gesture nearly undid Lillian's composure. Thank you, she managed, clutching the book as if it were made of gold rather than paper and leather. Outside, as Frank loaded their purchases into the wagon, he gave Lillian a sidelong glance. Edward seems to have taken quite an interest in your school-teaching ambitions. Lillian busied herself arranging her skirts as she climbed onto the wagon seat. He's interested in the improvement of Snowflake, that's all. Frank's snort indicated his skepticism, but he didn't press the matter as he flicked the reins to start the horses moving. That night, As Lillian sat by lamplight reading the borrowed volume of poetry, she found herself wondering about Hank Edwards. The revelation that he was raising an orphan nephew added another dimension to the complex man she was coming to admire. A solitary figure, yes, but one with a capacity for deep commitment and care. The tenderness with which he'd spoken to Timothy, the pride evident in the boys bearing these spoke of a household built on mutual respect and affection. The following 2 weeks passed in a flurry of preparation as Lillian developed her presentation for the town council. She drafted a proposed curriculum, listed the supplies that would be necessary, and composed a letter outlining her qualifications and teaching philosophy. Frank, reading over her work, nodded approvingly. "You've thought this through proper," he commented. "Can't imagine the council turning down such a well-considered proposal." The day of the meeting dawned clear and warm. Lillian dressed with care in her best gown, a blue calico that complemented her eyes and dark blonde hair. Frank, too, had made an effort, wearing a clean shirt with his Sunday jacket and actually trimming his beard for the occasion. The town hall proved to be a modest building adjacent to the church. Inside, 6 men of varying ages sat at a long table, with several townsfolk occupying benches along the walls. Lillian recognized Mrs. Pemberton from the general store and the elderly woman she'd seen at the trading post. Hank sat near the back, and he nodded encouragingly as Lillian and Frank entered. The chairman, a silver-haired man introduced as Judge Wilson, called the meeting to order. After disposing of several items of town business, he invited Lillian to present her proposal. Standing before the assembled council, Lillian felt a moment of trepidation. These men held the power to grant or deny her dream of establishing a school. But as she began to speak, her passion for education overcame her nervousness. She outlined her vision for a school that would provide not just basic literacy and numeracy, but also instruction in history, geography, natural sciences, and the arts. Every child, regardless of background or circumstances, deserves access to knowledge, she concluded. With your support, I believe we can create an educational environment that will benefit not only the current generation but the future of Snowflake itself. When she finished, there was a moment of silence, followed by Judge Wilson clearing his throat. "That's a mighty fine speech, Miss Matthews, and you clearly know your business when it comes to book learning. But I must ask, do you intend to make Snowflake your permanent home? Teaching requires commitment, and the children need stability." Lillian hesitated. When she'd first arrived in the territory, she'd viewed her stay at Frank's ranch as temporary, perhaps a year or two, until she decided on her next steps. But in the weeks since, something had shifted. The land, with its harsh beauty and open spaces, had begun to work its way into her heart. And there were other attachments forming, though she barely dared acknowledge them even to herself. "I came to the Arizona territory intending to make a new life," she replied carefully. "I've found Snowflake and its surroundings to be more welcoming than I anticipated. While I can't predict the future with certainty, I have no plans to leave anytime soon." This answer seemed to satisfy the judge, and the questions that followed were primarily practical regarding the proposed location, schedule, and budget. Hank contributed information about the space available at the trading post, which he offered rent-free for the first 6 months to allow the school to establish itself. After Lillian and the other observers were asked to wait outside while the council deliberated, she found herself standing on the town hall steps beside Hank. "You were impressive in there," he said quietly. "They'd be fools not to approve your proposal." "Thank you for your support," Lillian replied, "both with the space and your endorsement." "Self-interest," Hank claimed with a half-smile. "An educated populace is good for business, as I said before." "Is that truly your only motivation?" Lillian asked, emboldened by the intensity in his gaze. Before Hank could answer, the town hall door opened, and Judge Wilson beckoned them back inside. The council had reached a decision. "Miss Matthews," the judge announced once everyone was seated, "after careful consideration, we have voted to approve your proposal for the establishment of a school in Snowflake. The town will provide a stipend of $25 per month for your services as teacher, plus an additional allowance for necessary supplies and books. Joy bubbled up in Lillian's chest, and she barely managed to maintain her composure as Judge Wilson continued outlining the details of the agreement. The school would officially open in 4 weeks' time, allowing for preparation of the space and notification to families in the surrounding area. As the meeting concluded, Lillian found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Mrs. Pemberton offered to donate slates for students who couldn't afford their own. The blacksmith promised to fabricate hooks for a coat rack. Even Reverend Simmons, initially concerned about the potential for secular teachings, expressed his support after reviewing Lillian's proposed curriculum. Through it all, Lillian was acutely aware of Hank's presence nearby, his quiet pride evident in the way he watched her interact with the townspeople. When the crowd finally dispersed, he approached, Timothy at his side. "Congratulations, Miss Matthews," Timothy said politely, clearly coached in proper manners. "Will I be old enough to attend your school?" Lillian smiled warmly at the boy. "Absolutely, Timothy. I'll be teaching children from 6 to 16, and your uncle tells me you're 12. "Nearly 13, Timothy corrected with the importance of youth. "And I already know my letters and figures. Uncle Hank's been teaching me." "Has he indeed?" Lillian glanced at Hank, who looked slightly embarrassed at his nephew's disclosure. "Just the basics," Hank demurred. "Nothing like the education you'll provide." "Still," Lillian pressed, "it speaks well of you that you've taken the time. Many guardians neglect such matters entirely." Frank, who had been deep in conversation with Judge Wilson, rejoined them. "Well, schoolmarm, looks like you'll be making the journey to town regularly now. We'll need to figure out a more practical arrangement than me driving you in the wagon each time." "I have a suggestion," Hank offered. "The widow Carson's place is just at the edge of town. She's been looking to rent out her spare room for additional income. It would give Lillian a place to stay during the school week, and she could return to the ranch on weekends." Frank stroked his beard thoughtfully. "That's not a bad notion. Would save considerable time and effort compared to daily travel. Mrs. Carson is a respectable woman," Hank added, addressing what he correctly assumed would be Frank's primary concern. "Older than dirt and strict as they come, no one could question the propriety of such an arrangement." And so it was decided. Lillian would move into Mrs. Carson's spare room the week before school was to begin, giving her time to prepare the classroom space at the trading post. Frank would bring her belongings to town and help with any necessary modifications to the room that would serve as Snowflake's first proper school. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Lillian divided her time between ranch chores and preparations for the school. She created a register for student enrollment, developed more detailed lesson plans for different age groups, and carefully selected portions of her personal library to bring for the school's use. Frank, true to his word, fashioned simple benches and tables that could serve as desks. Martha contributed a handbell for calling students to order, and Mrs. Pemberton organized a sewing circle to create a proper American flag for the schoolroom. When the day finally came for Lillian to move to Mrs. Carson's, she was surprised by the emotion she felt at leaving the ranch, even temporarily. In just 2 months, it had begun to feel like home. "It's not like you're going to China," Frank teased, seeing her misty eyes as she packed the last of her things into a trunk. "It's 15 miles and you'll be back every weekend." "I know," Lillian admitted. "It's silly, I've grown fond of this place." Frank's weathered face softened. "Place grows on you. Happened to me too all those years ago. Came for the land, stayed for the life." He cleared his throat. "Your Aunt Sarah used to say the territory either spits you out in the first year or claims you forever. Seems like it might be claiming you." Mrs. Carson proved to be exactly as Hank had described, elderly, rigidly proper, and sharp as a tack despite her advanced years. Her home was immaculately kept, with antimacassars on every chair and Bible verses framed on every wall. She showed Lillian to a small but comfortable room at the back of the house, with a window overlooking a well-tended garden. "Breakfast at 6 sharp," the old woman informed her. "Supper at 5:30. I lock the doors at 8, so be sure you're inside by then. No gentlemen callers in your room, though you may receive visitors in the parlor until 7:30. Yes, Mrs. Carson, Lillian replied, suppressing a smile at the thought that anyone would consider her likely to entertain gentlemen callers at all. After Frank departed, promising to return on Friday to escort her back to the ranch for the weekend, Lillian made her way to the trading post to begin setting up her classroom. She found Hank and Timothy already hard at work, moving crates and shelving units to clear the large back room. Miss Matthews, Timothy greeted her enthusiastically. Uncle Hank found an old blackboard in the storeroom. It needs cleaning, but it should work just fine. That's wonderful, Timothy. And please, when we're not in school, you may call me Miss Lillian. She turned to Hank, who was wrestling a heavy cabinet into position along one wall. This is too much. You shouldn't be rearranging your entire store on my account. This room's been storage for odds and ends too long, Hank replied, straightening up and wiping his brow. Besides, Timothy's more excited about this school than I've seen him about anything in ages. Over the next few days, the transformation continued. The trading post's back room, once cluttered with excess inventory and rarely used equipment, became a bright, orderly classroom. Walls were whitewashed, windows cleaned to let in maximum light, and desks arranged in neat rows facing the blackboard. Hank contributed a sturdy desk for Lillian's use and hung a shelf for reference books within easy reach. Throughout the process, Lillian found herself working alongside Hank more often than not. Timothy was a willing helper, but his attention wandered as boys' attention often does. In the quiet moments when they worked together, Lillian discovered more layers to the complex man she'd first met during the lightning storm. Hank spoke of his childhood in Virginia, his education at a small college in Pennsylvania, and his brief career as a teacher before the war. He described the battles he'd survived, and, with greater reluctance, the nightmares that still occasionally plagued him. In turn, Lillian shared stories of her own life, her parents' gentle guidance, her struggles to establish herself as a governess in Boston's competitive society, and her grief when illness claimed both mother and father within months of each other. Loss shapes us, Hank observed one afternoon as they shelved books together, but it needn't define us. Is that why you came west? Lillian asked. To escape definition by your losses, Hank considered this, his hands pausing in their work. Perhaps. Or maybe to find a place where what a man does matters more than what he's lost. He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. What about you? Did you come to escape or to find? Both, I think, Lillian admitted. To escape the memories that haunted every corner of Boston, but also to find something, connection, perhaps, purpose. And have you found purpose, I mean, Lillian smiled, gesturing to the nearly completed classroom around them. I believe I'm on my way. The school opened on a Monday in early September. 17 students arrived that first morning, ranging from 6-year-old Sally Pemberton to 16-year-old James Olson, who towered over Lillian but ducked his head shyly when she welcomed him. By the end of the week, the number had grown to 22 as word spread to outlying ranches and farms. Lillian found herself rising before dawn each day, preparing lessons and walking the short distance from Mrs. Carson's house to the trading post in the gray light of morning. Hank was invariably already there, the lamps lit, and the stove burning cheerfully to ward off the autumn chill. He would greet her with a cup of coffee and a brief update on any town news before retreating to the front of the store to allow her to prepare for the day's classes. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying. Lillian grouped her students according to their abilities rather than strictly by age, allowing each child to progress at their own pace in different subjects. She was pleasantly surprised by their eagerness to learn. Even the older boys, whom she had expected might resist instruction from a woman, applied themselves diligently to their studies. Timothy proved to be one of her brightest pupils, with a particular aptitude for mathematics and a voracious appetite for reading. Lillian often found him lingering after dismissal, reluctant to leave the books and learning behind. On these occasions, Hank would sometimes join them, and the three would engage in discussions ranging from history to natural philosophy to literature. These after-school conversations became a highlight of Lillian's days. Hank's mind was quick and well-informed, his perspectives shaped by experiences far different from her own. They didn't always agree. Their debates about certain authors or historical interpretations could grow quite spirited, but there was always a fundamental respect underlying their discussions. As autumn deepened, Lillian settled into a rhythm. Weekdays were devoted to teaching and planning, with evenings spent grading assignments or reading by the fire in Mrs. Carson's parlor. Weekends at the ranch provided a different kind of satisfaction, the physical work of gardening, preserving, and helping with lighter ranch chores balanced the intellectual demands of teaching. Frank, observing her one Sunday as she kneaded bread dough with newly confident hands, remarked, "You've changed since you arrived, Lily girl." The childhood nickname, which Frank had begun using as they grew closer, made her smile. "How so, uncle? There's a steadiness to you now, a purpose." "When you first stepped off that stage, you looked like a strong wind might blow you away. Now you're rooted like one of those pines on the ridge." Lillian considered his words as she shaped the dough into loaves. "I feel different," she acknowledged. "More, capable perhaps, less afraid." Frank nodded approvingly. "Arizona agrees with you." He hesitated, then added with studied casualness, "Edwards asks after you every time I'm in town." Lillian kept her eyes on her work, though she couldn't prevent the warmth that rose to her cheeks. "As the proprietor of the building where I teach, he has a legitimate interest in my well-being." Frank's snort conveyed his opinion of this explanation. "Girl, I may be an old bachelor, but I ain't blind. Man doesn't ask about your favorite flowers, and whether you prefer sugar or honey in your tea out of legitimate interest in a tenant." Lillian nearly dropped the loaf pan she was holding. "He asked about my preferences for flowers and tea." Frank's eyes twinkled. "Caught your attention with that, did I?" "Yes, he did, though he tried to make it seem casual-like, and he's been ordering books that just happen to be by authors you've mentioned enjoying." The implications of this information made Lillian's heart beat faster. She'd been careful to keep her growing feelings for Hank Edwards contained, convinced that he viewed her merely as a colleague and perhaps a friend. The possibility that he might harbor deeper sentiments both thrilled and terrified her. "Uncle Frank, she stopped, uncertain how to proceed. Frank patted her flour-dusted hand affectionately. "No need to explain anything to me, Lily girl. Just know that if Edwards were to come calling with honorable intentions, he'd have my blessing. Man's got more substance than most, despite his quiet ways." The following Monday, Lillian returned to town with Frank's words echoing in her mind. As she approached the trading post, she saw Hank sweeping the boardwalk in front of the store, his tall figure silhouetted against the rising sun. He looked up at her approach, and the warmth in his smile sent a flutter through her chest. "Morning, Miss Matthews," he greeted, leaning the broom against the wall. "You're earlier than usual." "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," she replied, suddenly self-conscious. "I wanted to prepare a special lesson on constellations. The night sky has been so clear lately, and I thought the children might enjoy learning to identify the major star patterns." "An excellent idea," Hank approved. "Timothy's been fascinated by the stars since I first pointed out the North Star to help him find his way if ever lost." He held the door open for her. "I have something that might be of use for your lesson." Inside, he led her to a shelf behind the counter and retrieved a rolled parchment. "Got this from a traveling salesman last spring," he explained, carefully unfurling the document to reveal an intricately detailed star chart. "Thought it might interest Timothy, but it would serve better in your classroom." "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed, tracing the delicate lines connecting the stars to form familiar shapes. "But I couldn't possibly take it. It must have been expensive." "Consider it a loan, then," Hank suggested, "or a contribution to the education of Snowflake's youth, if you prefer." Their fingers brushed as he handed her the chart, and Lillian felt a jolt of awareness at the brief contact. Hank's eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither spoke. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. The spell was broken by the arrival of Timothy, bursting through the door with the energy of youth. "Uncle Hank, Miss Lillian, I finished that book of adventures you lent me, the one about the sailor on the whale ship. It was splendid." The moment passed, but something had shifted. In the days that followed, Lillian found herself noticing small changes in Hank's behavior, a tendency to linger longer in conversation, an increased awareness of her comfort. The classroom was always warm, her desk always supplied with fresh water, and a new hesitancy when their paths crossed unexpectedly, as if he wasn't quite sure how to act around her. For her part, Lillian became conscious of how often her thoughts turned to Hank throughout the day. She found herself choosing her dresses with more care each morning and pinning her hair in styles she knew were becoming. Mrs. Carson, sharp-eyed despite her age, observed these efforts with knowing looks but made no comment beyond an occasional murmured, "Mr. Edwards is certainly attentive to the needs of the school." As November arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the promise of winter, plans began for a Thanksgiving celebration in Snowflake. The town council decided to host a community dinner at the church, with each family contributing dishes for a shared feast. As the school teacher, Lillian was expected to attend and to help organize a short program of recitations and songs by her students. 2 weeks before the celebration, Hank approached her after school as she was gathering her materials to return to Mrs. Carson's. "Miss Matthews, Lillian," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant. "I was wondering if you might permit me to escort you to the Thanksgiving dinner." Though she had hoped for such an invitation, the reality of it made Lillian momentarily speechless. "Aye, that would be lovely," she managed finally. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards." "Hank," he reminded her gently, a smile warming his features. "If we're to attend a social function together, perhaps we should use our given names." "Hank," she echoed, returning his smile. "Yes, I would be honored to accompany you." "I'll speak with Frank when he comes to town on Friday," Hank added, "to ensure he has no objections." "That's thoughtful but unnecessary," Lillian assured him. "Uncle Frank has made it clear he holds you in the highest regard." The days leading up to Thanksgiving passed in a blur of preparations. Lillian rehearsed her students for their performances, helped with decorations for the church hall, and spent an entire Saturday at the ranch, baking pies under Martha's expert guidance. Through it all, anticipation of the dinner and Hank's escort bubbled just beneath the surface of her thoughts. The morning of the celebration dawned clear and cold. Lillian dressed with special care in her best gown, a deep burgundy wool that complemented her fair coloring. Mrs. Carson, who had appointed herself unofficial chaperone for the occasion, nodded approvingly as Lillian descended the stairs. "You'll do," the older woman pronounced, which from her was high praise indeed. "Mr. Edwards is punctual to a fault, so I expect him shortly." True to Mrs. Carson's prediction, Hank arrived precisely at the appointed time. Lillian's breath caught at the sight of him standing in the parlor doorway. He wore a dark suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, with a crisp white shirt and carefully knotted tie. His dark hair was neatly trimmed and he'd shaved with particular attention. "Miss Matthews," he greeted, his voice warm, "you look beautiful." "Thank you," Lillian replied, accepting the small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers he offered. "You're quite handsome yourself, Mrs. Carson cleared her throat pointedly. "The church bell will be ringing soon. Best be on your way." The walk to the church was brief but magical. The air held the crispness of approaching winter, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their path. Hank offered his arm, and Lillian placed her gloved hand in the crook of his elbow, acutely aware of his solid presence beside her. "Timothy is excited about the program," Hank mentioned as they walked. "He's been practicing his recitation even while doing his chores." "He's a wonderful boy," Lillian said sincerely. "You've done a remarkable job with him, especially under such difficult circumstances." "He makes it easy," Hank replied, "has a good heart and a curious mind." After a brief pause, he added, "My sister would be proud of the young man he's becoming." She worried about him constantly, even on her deathbed. "You were close to your sister?" Lillian asked gently. Hank nodded. "Eliza was my only family after the war. Her husband died at Chancellorsville, leaving her alone with an infant son, Timothy's older brother. She remarried a few years later to a man named Collins who was heading west to try his luck in the New Mexico mines. They had Timothy, and life was good for a while. Then the smallpox came." He fell silent, and Lillian squeezed his arm in silent sympathy. Eliza made me promise to raise Timothy as my own if anything happened to her and Collins. Hank continued after a moment. When word came of the outbreak, I traveled to their settlement, but by the time I arrived, Eliza, Collins, and the older boy were already gone. Timothy had survived, though barely. He was just 9 years old. How devastating for him, Lillian murmured. And for you, we healed together, Hank said simply. Each day a little stronger than the last. They had reached the church, where lanterns illuminated the path to the hall behind the main building. Inside, long tables covered with white cloths stretched the length of the room, already laden with dishes brought by early arrivals. Children darted between adults, their excitement palpable in the air. The evening unfolded like a scene from a cherished storybook. The shared meal was abundant and delicious, with Frank's roasted turkey and Martha's corn pudding earning particular praise. The children's program went smoothly, with Timothy's recitation of The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere drawing enthusiastic applause. Even shy James Olson managed to overcome his nervousness to lead the older boys in a patriotic song. Throughout it all, Lillian was conscious of Hank seated beside her, of his occasional glances and the way his hand sometimes brushed hers as they reached for the salt or passed a serving dish. These small contacts, innocent as they were, sent warmth spiraling through her. After the meal, as the tables were cleared for dancing, Hank leaned closer. "Would you honor me with a dance, Lillian?" The local fiddler struck up a lively tune, and Hank led Lillian onto the floor. He proved to be a surprisingly graceful dancer, guiding her through the steps with confidence. As they circled among the other couples, Lillian caught Frank watching them with undisguised approval. Later, when the music slowed, Hank's hand at her waist drew her slightly closer than was strictly proper. Lillian found she didn't mind in the least. "I've been meaning to ask," Hank said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "if you'd consider joining Timothy and me for Christmas dinner. Frank is welcome too, of course." "I'd like that very much," Lillian replied, her heart quickening at the invitation. "Though I believe Uncle Frank has already accepted an invitation to dine with the Wilkins family." She didn't add that Frank had winked broadly when informing her of this arrangement, his matchmaking intentions transparent. "Then perhaps just you," Hank suggested, his eyes holding hers. "If that wouldn't be improper. Mrs. Carson would likely insist on accompanying me as chaperone," Lillian warned, half joking. "Mrs. Carson is spending Christmas with her daughter in Prescott," Hank informed her with a hint of mischief. "But Timothy will be present at all times, so your reputation will remain unblemished." The evening ended all too soon. As the celebration wound down, Hank escorted Lillian and Mrs. Carson back to their home, the older woman maintaining a discreet distance ahead of them to allow for private conversation. At the gate, Mrs. Carson pointedly continued up the path to the house, leaving Hank and Lillian momentarily alone in the silver moonlight. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," Lillian said softly. "The pleasure was mine," Hank replied. He hesitated, then took her hand gently in his. "Lillian, I've grown very fond of you these past months." Lillian's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. "And I of you," she admitted. Hank's smile in the moonlight was worth every moment of uncertainty she'd experienced. Slowly, giving her ample opportunity to withdraw, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Lillian. Sweet dreams." "Good night, Hank," she whispered, reluctant to end the moment but aware of Mrs. Carson's impatient figure silhouetted in the doorway. As November gave way to December, a new closeness developed between Hank and Lillian. Nothing inappropriate, they were both too mindful of propriety and her position as the town's teacher to risk scandal, but there was an understanding between them, an acknowledgement of deepening feelings. Hank began walking Lillian to Mrs. Carson's after school each day, regardless of weather. Sometimes Timothy accompanied them, chattering about the day's lessons or his latest adventure with the other boys. Other times, the walk was just the two of them, sharing thoughts and dreams in the gathering twilight. One such afternoon, as they strolled through a light dusting of early snow, Hank spoke of his hopes for the trading post. "I've been thinking of adding a proper pharmacy section. Doc Sanders is getting on in years, and there's no younger doctor looking to settle in Snowflake. Basic medicines and remedies would serve the community well. That's a wonderful idea, Lillian encouraged. Your store is already the heart of the town in many ways. This would make it even more essential. And what of your dreams? Hank asked. Beyond the school, I mean. Lillian considered the question carefully. When I first came west, I thought perhaps I'd teach for a year or two, then move on perhaps to California or back east. But now, she glanced at him, then quickly away. Now I find I'm developing roots here. The children, the community, the land itself, they've become important to me. Hank's hand found hers, his grip warm even through their gloves. I'm glad to hear it, he said simply. The week before Christmas brought a fierce snowstorm that forced Lillian to cancel school for 2 days. Confined to Mrs. Carson's house, she used the unexpected free time to complete the gifts. She'd been preparing a knitted scarf for Frank, embroidered handkerchiefs for Martha. And for Hank and Timothy, special editions of favorite books she'd ordered from a catalog months earlier. When the storm finally abated, the world outside was transformed into a glittering white landscape. The school resumed with excitement as the children brought news of sledding hills and snowmen. Christmas was the main topic of conversation, with even the oldest students unable to conceal their anticipation of the holiday. Lillian had planned a small celebration for the last day before the Christmas break. The children would exchange simple handmade gifts, recite seasonal poems, and enjoy treats provided by the parents. What she hadn't expected was for Hank to arrive midway through the festivities, bearing a large covered object. Mr. Edwards has a surprise for the school, Lillian announced as Hank set his burden on her desk and removed the covering to reveal a beautiful globe. The children crowded forward, exclaiming over the colorful depiction of continents and oceans. Even James Olson couldn't maintain his adolescent dignity in the face of such a marvel. This is incredibly generous, Lillian said quietly to Hank as the children took turns spinning the globe. Education requires proper tools, Hank replied with a shrug that didn't quite disguise his pleasure at her reaction. Besides, Timothy mentioned your lessons on world geography, thought this might help bring it to life for them. The last day of school ended with hugs, well wishes, and promises to return in the new year. As the last child departed, Lillian began tidying the classroom, aware of Hank watching from near the door. Will you still join us for Christmas dinner? He asked. The invitation stands despite Mrs. Carson's absence from town. I wouldn't miss it, Lillian assured him. Uncle Frank is leaving tomorrow to spend the holiday with the Wilkins family, so I'll be staying in town. Alone at Mrs. Carson's, Hank frowned at the thought. Mrs. Peterson from the church has invited me for Christmas Eve, Lillian explained, and then I'll be with you and Timothy on Christmas Day. Hardly alone. Still, the concern in his expression touched her. It had been a long time since anyone had worried about her spending holidays in solitude. During her years as a governess, she'd often found herself in an awkward middle position, neither family nor servant, included in celebrations but always slightly apart. Christmas Eve passed pleasantly with the Peterson family, though Lillian found her thoughts frequently straying to the following day and dinner at Hank's home. She'd never been to his private quarters above the trading post and was curious about the space where he and Timothy lived their daily lives. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, the snow-covered landscape glittering in the sunlight. Lillian dressed with care in a forest green dress that Mrs. Carson had helped her alter to the latest fashion, with a touch of lace at the collar and cuffs. Her gift for Timothy, a handsome edition of Treasure Island, was wrapped in brown paper tied with red ribbon. For Hank, she had found a rare volume of Walt Whitman's poetry, which she hoped would please him. At precisely noon, she made her way to the trading post, her arms laden with gifts and a basket containing an apple pie she'd baked the previous day. The store was closed for the holiday, but Hank must have been watching for her arrival, for the door opened before she could knock. "Merry Christmas, Lillian," he greeted, taking the basket and packages from her. His eyes warmed as they took in her appearance. "You look lovely." "Merry Christmas, Hank," she replied, stepping into the welcoming warmth of the store. Something smells wonderful. Timothy's been helping me prepare since dawn, Hank said, leading her toward a staircase at the back of the store that Lillian had noticed but never used. He's determined to impress you with his cooking skills. The living quarters above the trading post surprised Lillian with their comfort and thoughtful arrangement. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a small kitchen visible through an open doorway. Windows on two sides provided ample light, and simple but attractive curtains framed the views of snow-covered Snowflake. A modestly sized Christmas tree stood in one corner, decorated with handmade ornaments and small candles waiting to be lit. The dining table was set with care, a red cloth brightening the simple white dishes. On the sideboard, a collection of framed photographs caught Lillian's attention. Hank in uniform, a younger version of him with a pretty woman who must have been his sister Eliza, and a more recent image of Hank and Timothy standing proudly before the trading post. Miss Lillian. Timothy's enthusiastic greeting drew her attention away from the photographs. The boy emerged from the kitchen, an apron protecting his good clothes. Merry Christmas. Uncle Hank let me make the bread all by myself, and it actually turned out good. Merry Christmas, Timothy, Lillian replied, smiling at his excitement. I can't wait to taste it. Is there anything I can help with? Between the three of them, the final dinner preparations were quickly completed. Hank carved the roasted chicken with expert precision, while Timothy proudly presented his freshly baked bread. Lillian arranged her pie on the sideboard for dessert. The meal was delicious, the conversation warm and easy. Timothy regaled them with tales of Christmas celebrations he remembered from his early childhood, while Hank occasionally added details or gently corrected exaggerations. Lillian shared traditions from her own family's holidays in Boston: the midnight church service, the grand feasts, the carolers who went from house to house on Christmas Eve. After the meal, Timothy could barely contain his excitement as they gathered around the tree for the exchange of gifts. Hank lit the small candles, and in their warm glow, the simple room felt magical. Timothy's delight in the book Lillian had brought him was genuine and touching. I've been wanting to read this forever, he exclaimed, already paging through the illustrations. Thank you, Miss Lillian. From Timothy, Lillian received a beautifully carved wooden box. Uncle Hank helped me make it, the boy admitted, but I did most of the sanding and all the carving on the lid myself. It's exquisite, Lillian assured him, tracing the delicate pine tree design on the lid. I shall treasure it always. When it came time to exchange gifts with Hank, Lillian felt a flutter of nervousness. Would he appreciate the book she'd chosen? But her concerns proved unfounded. His face lit with genuine pleasure as he unwrapped the volume of poetry. Whitman, he said, his voice warm with appreciation. How did you know he's one of my favorites? You quoted Song of Myself during one of our discussions about American literature, Lillian reminded him. And I noticed you didn't have his collected works on your shelves. It's perfect, Hank assured her, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Thank you. Hank's gift to her was small, wrapped in simple brown paper. Lillian carefully unwrapped it to reveal a velvet box. Inside nestled a silver pendant in the shape of a book, suspended from a delicate chain. When she pressed the tiny clasp, the book opened to reveal a miniature compass. It's beautiful, she breathed, touching the pendant gently. I thought it fitting, Hank explained, his voice softer than usual. Books have always guided your path, and now the compass can remind you that you've found your true north. The words held layers of meaning that made Lillian's heart race. Would you help me put it on? She asked, offering him the necklace and turning slightly. Hank's fingers were surprisingly deft as he fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck. Lillian was acutely aware of his closeness, of the gentle touch of his hands and the warmth of his breath against her hair. Perfect, he murmured as she turned back to face him. The moment was interrupted by Timothy's excited exclamation as he discovered the wooden sled Hank had hidden behind the sofa, his main Christmas gift. Can we try it out now, Uncle Hank, please? Hank laughed at the boy's eagerness. I suppose a test run wouldn't hurt. Bundle up warm, though. The temperature's dropping. The three ventured out into the crisp winter afternoon, making their way to a small hill on the outskirts of town where other children were already enjoying the snowy conditions. Timothy immediately joined a group of his schoolmates, proudly showing off his new sled. Hank and Lillian found a relatively sheltered spot to watch the children's antics. Standing close beside her, Hank hesitantly took Lillian's gloved hand in his. When she made no move to pull away, his grip tightened slightly. "I have a confession," he said after a moment, his gaze fixed on the sledding children. "I've been thinking about this Christmas for weeks, about having you in my home, sharing the day with Timothy and me." Lillian's heart quickened at his words. "I've been looking forward to it too," she admitted. Hank turned to face her then, his expression serious. "Lillian, I know we haven't known each other long by some standards, but these past months, they've meant everything to me." "And to me," Lillian replied softly. "I find myself thinking about you constantly," Hank continued, his voice low and intense. "When you're teaching in the back room, I catch myself making excuses to walk past the door just to glimpse you. When you leave each afternoon, I count the hours until morning when I'll see you again." Lillian felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. "I watch for you too," she confessed. "Every morning I look forward to that moment when you hand me my coffee and ask about my plans for the day." Hank's smile was radiant. "Then I'm not alone in these feelings." "No," Lillian assured him. "You're not alone." His free hand rose to touch her cheek gently. "I never expected to find someone like you, Lillian Matthews. Never thought I'd feel this way again, or perhaps at all." A shout from the sledding hill drew their attention momentarily as Timothy successfully navigated a particularly challenging run. The boy waved triumphantly, and they both waved back, smiling at his exuberance. "He adores you, you know," Hank said, his eyes still on his nephew. "Talks about Miss Lillian constantly." "The feeling is mutual," Lillian assured him. "He's a wonderful boy, smart, kind, thoughtful. You've raised him well." "I've done my best," Hank acknowledged, "but there are times I worry it's not enough. A boy needs more than just an uncle, especially one who's figuring things out as he goes along." The implication in his words made Lillian's breath catch. Before she could respond, however, Timothy came racing up, cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. "Uncle Hank, Miss Lillian, did you see me?" "I went all the way down without falling once. We saw," Hank confirmed, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "Very impressive. But it's getting dark and we should head back. Don't want Miss Lillian catching a chill." The walk back to town was filled with Timothy's animated descriptions of his sledding adventures. At the trading post, the boy reluctantly agreed to hang his wet outer garments to dry and wash up for the evening. "I should probably return to Mrs. Carson's before it gets much later," Lillian said once Timothy had disappeared into the washroom. "Of course," Hank agreed, though she thought she detected a note of disappointment in his voice. "I'll walk you." They made the short journey to Mrs. Carson's house in comfortable silence, their breath creating clouds in the cold evening air. At the gate, Hank turned to face her. "Thank you for sharing Christmas with us," he said softly. "It meant a great deal to Timothy and to me." "It was a perfect day," Lillian replied truthfully. "One I'll always remember." Hank's gaze dropped to the pendant resting at the base of her throat. "You're wearing it, of course. It's beautiful, and I treasure the sentiment behind it." Something in her tone or expression must have given him courage, for Hank stepped closer, his hands coming to rest lightly on her waist. "Lillian," he murmured, his voice a gentle question. In answer, she raised her face to his. The first touch of his lips against hers was soft, almost tentative, a question rather than a demand. When she responded, leaning slightly into the contact, his arms tightened around her, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened. Time seemed suspended in the quiet winter night. The kiss was everything Lillian had dreamed it might be, tender yet passionate, a perfect expression of the feelings that had been building between them for months. When they finally parted, Hank rested his forehead against hers for a moment. "I've wanted to do that since the night of the storm," he confessed, his voice husky. "I'm glad you waited," Lillian replied with a small smile, "but I'm equally glad you finally did it." With obvious reluctance, Hank stepped back, though he kept hold of her hands. "I should let you go inside before we create a scandal that would set Mrs. Carson's tongue wagging for months." Lillian laughed softly. "Yes, that would be prudent." She squeezed his hands once more before releasing them. "Good night, Hank. Thank you for a wonderful Christmas." "Good night, Lillian," he replied, his eyes warm in the gathering darkness. "Sweet dreams." As January turned to February, Hank and Lillian settled into a courtship that quickly became the talk of Snowflake. There were Sunday afternoon rides when weather permitted, shared meals with Frank at the ranch, and quiet evenings reading by the fire in Mrs. Carson's parlor under the watchful but increasingly indulgent eye of the older woman. Timothy embraced the changing relationship with enthusiasm, often serving as an unofficial chaperone on their outings. His affection for Lillian grew as she took a greater interest in his education and well-being, helping him with difficult assignments and encouraging his natural curiosity about the world. The school continued to thrive, with enrollment growing as word spread of the quality of instruction available in Snowflake. By spring, Lillian had 28 regular students and was considering how to accommodate more as new families arrived in the area. One warm evening in early April, Hank invited Lillian for a sunset ride to a bluff overlooking the valley. Timothy, who usually accompanied them on such excursions, was conspicuously absent, having been invited to dinner at a friend's home. "Uncle Frank knows where we're going." Hank confirmed as he helped Lillian mount her horse. "Yes, and approves completely," she assured him with a smile. "Though he did suggest I return at a reasonable hour as we have early chores tomorrow." The ride to the bluff was peaceful, the landscape vibrant with spring growth after winter's dormancy. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows they passed, and birds called to each other from newly leafed trees. At the top of the bluff, Hank had prepared a simple picnic bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a bottle of cider. As they watched the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Hank took Lillian's hand in his. "Do you remember the night we met?" he asked, his voice reflective. "The lightning storm, how could I forget?" Lillian replied. "I was terrified, soaked to the skin, and certain I'd made a terrible mistake coming west. And now," she smiled, squeezing his hand, "now I know it was the best decision I ever made." Hank's expression grew serious. "When I opened the door that night and saw you standing there, something shifted inside me. It was as if a part of me that had been sleeping for years suddenly woke up." "I felt it too," Lillian admitted softly. "Not immediately. Perhaps I was too cold and frightened to notice much beyond the shelter you offered. But by morning, I knew you were someone special." Hank released her hand and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that glinted in the fading sunlight. "Lillian Matthews," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You've brought joy not just to me, but to Timothy, to your students, to this whole community." He opened his hand to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small, perfect diamond. "I love you with all that I am. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had begun to hope for this moment, the reality of it still made Lillian's heart race. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, Hank, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he was pulling her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the joy and promise of their future together. The announcement of their engagement was met with universal approval in Snowflake. Judge Wilson offered to perform the ceremony himself, Mrs. Pemberton immediately began organizing a quilting circle to create a wedding gift, and Timothy practically vibrated with excitement at the news that Miss Lillian would officially become part of his family. Frank's reaction was one of quiet satisfaction. "Knew it from the start," he claimed, though Lillian doubted this was entirely true. "Man doesn't offer shelter in a storm and then his heart unless there's a connection right from the beginning." The wedding was planned for mid-June, after the school term ended. Lillian would continue teaching, but would move from Mrs. Carson's into the expanded living quarters above the trading post, which Hank had already begun renovating to accommodate a wife and growing boy. "And perhaps more family in time," he suggested one evening as they discussed the plans, his expression questioning. Lillian's heart warmed at the thought. "I would like that very much," she assured him. "A brother or sister for Timothy if we're blessed." On the evening before their wedding, as Lillian finished packing her belongings at Mrs. Carson's, a knock came at the door. To her surprise, the caller was Martha Wilkins, who had traveled from the ranch specifically to deliver a package. "From your Aunt Sarah," Frank explained when summoned from the hotel where he was staying for the wedding. "She made it years ago, then asked me to keep it safe for when you married." The package contained a wedding quilt of exquisite workmanship, each square depicting a scene from pioneer life: a covered wagon crossing the plains, a homestead raising, children at play, a family gathered around a hearth. The border was embroidered with a Bible verse: "Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge, thy people shall be my people." "I never even met her," Lillian said softly, tracing the intricate stitching. "She knew of you, though," Frank replied. "Your father wrote to us regularly, sent photographs. Sarah always said she hoped you'd find your way west someday, though neither of us imagined the circumstances that would bring you." The wedding day dawned clear and bright. The ceremony was held in the church, decorated with wildflowers gathered by Lillian's students. She wore a dress of ivory silk, a gift from Mrs. Pemberton and the other ladies of the town, who had pooled their resources to order the fabric from back east and then worked together to create the garment. As Lillian walked down the aisle on Frank's arm, her gaze fixed on Hank waiting before the altar, she marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened, grief-stricken young woman who had stepped off the stage-coach less than a year ago could never have imagined the happiness that awaited her in this remote corner of the Arizona Territory. Judge Wilson performed the ceremony with dignity and warmth, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled townspeople rattled the church windows. Timothy was the first to congratulate them, throwing his arms around them both in an enthusiastic embrace that made everyone laugh. The celebration continued at the town hall, where tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every household in Snowflake. There was dancing, speeches, and more than a few happy tears as the community celebrated not just a wedding but the union of two people who had become essential to the fabric of their town. Late in the evening, as the festivities were winding down, Hank drew Lillian aside. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Edwards?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. The name, her new name, sent a thrill through her. "Yes," she replied simply, taking the hand he offered. Timothy had been sent to spend the night with the Peterson family, giving the newlyweds privacy on their wedding night. As they walked through the quiet streets of Snowflake, Hank's arm around her waist, Lillian felt a deep contentment settle in her soul. At the trading post, now their shared home, Hank paused before the door. "I believe there's a tradition to be observed," he said with a smile, and before Lillian could respond, he had swept her into his arms and carried her across the threshold. The renovated living quarters were transformed in the soft lamplight. Flowers adorned every surface, and the new curtains Lillian had sewn fluttered gently in the breeze from the open windows. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of the handmade quilt from Aunt Sarah spread across the bed. "Welcome home, Lillian Edwards," Hank said softly, setting her on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "It's perfect," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Everything is perfect." Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Hank's fingers gently tracing patterns on her bare shoulder, Lillian reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had led her to this moment of complete happiness. "What are you thinking about?" Hank murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "About lightning storms," she replied honestly, "and how something that seems frightening can actually be the beginning of something beautiful." Hank's arms tightened around her. "I thank God every day for bringing you to my door that night," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and that storm changed my life forever." "And mine," Lillian agreed, raising her face for his kiss. "For the better, in every possible way." 5 years later, Lillian stood on the porch of their home, watching as Hank taught their 3-year-old son Joseph to ride his first pony. Timothy, now 17 and nearly as tall as his uncle, stood ready to catch the boy if he should slip, though the gentle mare seemed unlikely to make any sudden movements that might unseat her precious cargo. 4-year-old Sarah sat at Lillian's feet, carefully copying her letters onto a slate already showing signs of the same love of learning that had shaped her mother's life. The baby, 2-month-old Michael, slept peacefully in his cradle nearby, occasionally stirring as a gentle breeze ruffled the wildflowers Lillian had planted along the edge of the yard. Their home had expanded along with their family. 2 years after their marriage, when it became clear that the living quarters above the trading post would soon be too cramped, Hank had purchased land on the outskirts of Snowflake and built a spacious house with plenty of room for their growing brood. The trading post continued to thrive, now with a dedicated pharmacy section as Hank had envisioned, and Timothy was learning the business with an eye toward eventually joining Hank as a partner. The school had outgrown the back room of the trading post as well. With support from the town council and donations from local families, a proper schoolhouse had been built the previous year. Lillian still served as the primary teacher, though she had recently hired an assistant to help with the younger children, particularly during times when her own maternal duties kept her at home. Uncle Frank remained at Silver Creek Ranch, though he visited often. Martha Wilkins had become a permanent fixture there, initially as housekeeper, but eventually, to no one's surprise, as Frank's wife. They were expecting their first grandchild soon, as Martha's daughter from her first marriage was due to deliver in the fall. As Lillian watched Joseph's face light up with delight when Hank allowed the pony to move into a gentle trot, her heart overflowed with gratitude. The path that had brought her west had been paved with loss and uncertainty, but had led to a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined. A rumble of thunder in the distance drew her attention to the horizon, where dark clouds were gathering. The sight no longer inspired fear, but rather a fond remembrance of the night that had changed everything. "Storm coming," Hank called, lifting Joseph from the pony and handing him to Timothy. "Better get everyone inside." As they gathered children and belongings and hurried toward the house, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Inside, Hank stoked the fire while Timothy entertained Joseph and Sarah with stories. Lillian settled in a rocking chair with baby Michael, who had awakened at the commotion. Through the windows, lightning illuminated the darkening landscape, followed by the deep roll of thunder. But within the walls of their home, all was warmth and security and love. Hank came to stand beside Lillian's chair, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Reminds me of the night we met," he said softly, echoing her own thoughts. Lillian smiled up at him, covering his hand with her own. "The best night of my life, though I didn't know it at the time." As the storm raged outside and their children played safely within, Lillian and Hank shared a look of perfect understanding, two people who had found in each other not just love but home, in the truest sense of the word. From that first night when she was locked out in a lightning storm, until this moment years later, their journey together had been a testament to the power of unexpected beginnings and the enduring strength of love that grows stronger with each passing day.